Oregon, 2009. A small town once known for its quiet mornings and coffee-scented streets was forever changed when an 18-year-old barista named Dylan Mercer vanished after his late shift at a local cafe. His car was found idling by the roadside, headlights still glowing through the mist. But Dylan was gone. For years, police followed false leads. Theories crumbled and whispers of corruption clouded the case. Families moved on. But Dylan's mother never stopped asking questions. Then, more than a decade later, a single DNA match cracked open the silence, and the name tied to that evidence would shake the entire community. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the spring of 2009, life in the small Oregon town of Brookvale moved at an easy, unhurried pace. Locals described it as a place where everyone knew each other's names, where the biggest weekend event was the high school baseball game, and where people still left their front doors unlocked. Among those familiar faces was 18-year-old Dylan Mercer, a barista at the town's beloved coffee shop, Riverbend Coffee. Dylan was the kind of teenager who stood out not because he sought attention, but because he seemed genuinely kind. He had a quiet confidence, the kind that came from working hard and dreaming big. Between school and his cafe shifts, he spent his evenings sketching the forests and mountains that framed his small town. The same landscapes he hoped to study one day in college as an environmental design major. He talked about leaving Brookvale for Portland State University, but he also spoke of coming back one day to help his mom buy her own house. Those who knew him best said Dylan's motivation came from his family. His mother, Elaine Mercer, was a nurse's assistant at the local clinic, and his younger sister, Kara, just 12 at the time, adored him. Their father had left years earlier, leaving Dylan to become the man of the house far too soon. He helped his mom fix things around their aging cabin, and sometimes took extra cafe shifts just to make sure Kara had what she needed for school. At Riverbend Coffee, Dylan was everyone's favorite barista. He remembered regulars' names, their orders, and even their small talk. Truckers stopping through on their morning route swore by his caramel lattes, while local retirees sat in the corner just to chat with him. Even his manager described him as the kid who made mornings better, but behind those cheerful smiles something was shifting, something subtle, something almost invisible. A few of Dylan's co-workers later recalled that he seemed distracted in those final weeks. He'd glance toward the cafe's front windows when no one was there, or step outside to take calls he didn't explain. Once a friend noticed him quickly change the subject when someone asked about a strange man who had been sitting outside the shop several afternoons in a row. Brookvale wasn't the kind of town that invited suspicion. People waved at strangers, not questioned them. But in hindsight, there were signs, fleeting, easily dismissed, that someone had begun taking an unusual interest in Dylan. A car seen parked across from his home late at night. A missed call from an unknown number. A friend's uneasy comment that Dylan wasn't sleeping much lately. Still, no one imagined danger could reach someone like him. Dylan was young, responsible, and deeply loved. Whatever was happening, he didn't share it. Not with his friends, not even with his mother. That spring, the Mercer family was busy planning his graduation celebration. The coffee shop crew was designing a small "Good Luck Dylan" banner. The world around him moved forward, unaware that its calm surface was beginning to crack. Because somewhere just beyond that peaceful Oregon forest line, someone was watching. Someone had already decided that Dylan Mercer's life, full of potential, promise, and innocence, was about to be cut short. Who was following Dylan Mercer in those final days, and why did no one notice? March 14, 2009, the night that changed everything. It was the kind of Oregon evening that felt almost cinematic, mist rolling over the river, distant sounds of laughter from a Friday night crowd, and the low hum of cars passing through the quiet streets of Brookvale. Inside Riverbend Coffee, Dylan Mercer wiped down the counter for the last time that night. The cafe had just closed and the warm smell of roasted beans hung in the air. He signed the closing log, exchanged a few jokes with his coworker, and grabbed his denim jacket from the hook by the back door. The timestamp on the security footage read 9:37 p.m. Dylan locked the door, turned back to wave, and disappeared into the cool night air. His small blue sedan was parked near the old bridge, a place known for its quiet, scenic view of the water. The last glimpse anyone ever saw of him was the faint blur of his reflection in the car window as he opened the door. After that moment, Dylan Mercer vanished. When he didn't return home that night, his mother, Elaine, tried to reassure herself that maybe he'd stayed at a friend's house. But by 2 a.m., her instincts told her something was wrong. She called his phone, straight to voicemail. She called again, nothing. By sunrise, panic had set in. Elaine called Dylan's manager, then his friends. No one had heard from him since the cafe closed. At 6:15 a.m., a sheriff's deputy responded to a missing person report and began checking the roads between the coffee shop and the Mercer home. Just after 7:00 a.m., a patrol officer spotted a car pulled off near Miller Creek Road about 3 miles from town. The engine was off, the keys were still in the ignition, and a half-finished coffee cup sat in the holder. Dylan's phone was missing, but his wallet was on the passenger seat. The car was locked from the outside. The scene made little sense. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no broken glass, no tire marks suggesting another vehicle had been there. The muddy ground around the car was undisturbed, except for the faint trace of what looked like a single shoe print leading toward the tree line. Officers extended the search into the surrounding woods, combing through brush and creek beds. Volunteers joined in as word spread that Dylan Mercer, the friendly barista everyone knew, was missing. By that afternoon, the once quiet town had turned into a search grid marked by yellow tape and flashlights cutting through the fog. Helicopters hovered overhead. K-9 units traced scent trails that vanished near the riverbank. For every hour that passed, hope slipped a little further away. By nightfall, the reality began to sink in. This wasn't a teenager who'd run away. This was something far worse. Elaine stood by the roadside as deputies towed her son's car away for evidence, clutching his jacket in disbelief. In a town where nothing bad was supposed to happen, people locked their doors that night for the first time in years. The silence of that Oregon forest held its secrets tightly. But as detectives prepared to search deeper the next morning, no one was ready for what they were about to uncover. What did police find when they began combing the forest surrounding Dylan's last known location? 3 days after Dylan Mercer disappeared, the search entered its most desperate phase. Volunteers combed the woods surrounding Silver Creek Trail, a rugged area of forest stretching several miles beyond the old bridge where his car had been found. The terrain was uneven, damp and tangled with moss-covered logs, the kind of place where sound was swallowed whole by the trees. On the third afternoon, a hiker named Thomas Briggs veered off the main trail near the ravine, following the faint shimmer of something in the dirt. What he found would end the town's fragile hope in a single moment. Torn fabric, part of a blue cafe uniform, clung to the underbrush. Nearby lay a wallet, its contents scattered by the wind, and beneath it all streaks of blood on the leaves, faint but unmistakable. Briggs froze. His call to 911 came through at 4:47 p.m., his voice trembling as he described the discovery. Within hours, the area was locked down. Detectives, forensic units, and deputies formed a perimeter, while the light faded behind the tree line. Flashlights flickered against the pine trunks as evidence markers multiplied, a trail of disturbed soil, an impression of a shoe, and the glint of a broken phone screen just beyond the creek bed. When forensic teams confirmed that the wallet and uniform belonged to Dylan Mercer, the case shifted from missing person to homicide. 2 days later, during a secondary grid search, investigators uncovered Dylan's body in a shallow depression about 50 yards from the original find site. He had been partially covered with pine needles and branches, a crude attempt to conceal him. The coroner's report described signs of blunt force trauma to the head and upper body, along with defensive wounds on his arms. There were no indications of robbery or assault. His watch and wallet were still present. Whoever had done this hadn't taken anything, and only his life. For the small Oregon community, disbelief turned to mourning. News cameras lined Main Street as Riverbend Coffee shut its doors, transforming into a memorial site covered in flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Students held vigils, pastors offered prayers, and local papers printed Dylan's smiling photo under the headline, "Gone Too Soon." But inside the Brookvale Sheriff's Department, confusion reigned. The crime scene was meticulous, too meticulous. No fingerprints, no usable DNA, no murder weapon. Even the soil beneath Dylan's body yielded little. The medical examiner placed the time of death within hours of his disappearance. suggesting the killer had acted quickly and vanished just as fast. Detectives began re-interviewing everyone Dylan knew, friends, co-workers, even customers. But each lead fizzled out. There was no history of conflict, no known enemies, no reason anyone would want to harm him. The brutality of the attack, however, told a different story, one that felt deeply personal. Someone had been close enough to gain his trust, precise enough to erase their trace, and cold enough to bury the evidence beneath the trees. And as the investigation deepened, one haunting question lingered over Brookvale like fog rolling through the valley. Who could have wanted an 18-year-old barista dead, and how did they cover their tracks so perfectly? The first weeks after Dylan Mercer's body was found were a blur of interviews, speculation, and mounting frustration. Detectives from the Brookvale Sheriff's Department, aided by the Oregon State Police, launched what they described as one of the most intensive investigations the small county had ever seen. Every friend, co-worker, and acquaintance was questioned. Investigators started with Riverbend Coffee. Dylan's manager handed over shift logs, security footage, and employee rosters. Co-workers remembered Dylan as responsible and easygoing, but a few recalled something that now seemed haunting: a man who had begun showing up at the cafe in the weeks before Dylan's disappearance. He never ordered anything, just sat near the window watching. "He gave me chills," one barista said. The kind of person who didn't blink when you looked back. Police circulated the man's description, but without a name, they hit a dead end. No one knew who he was. No vehicle, no license plate, nothing to trace. Tips poured in from nearby towns, but none panned out. As the investigation dragged on, the rumor mill in Brookvale spun out of control. Some locals whispered that Dylan had been targeted by a jealous ex. Others claimed it was a robbery gone wrong. A few, frustrated by the lack of progress, went further, suggesting police incompetence or even corruption. When a local blogger accused the sheriff's office of burying evidence to protect someone, tensions between the community and law enforcement deepened. Behind closed doors, the detectives were running out of leads. The forensics lab had collected fibers from Dylan's clothes, soil samples from the crime scene, and partial DNA from an unidentified hair strand. But nothing matched any entry in the national database. Psychological profilers were brought in, hypothesizing that the killer was someone who knew the victim personally, perhaps a co-worker or regular customer. Investigators re-interviewed Elaine Mercer, Dylan's mother, asking if her son had recently been afraid of anyone or mentioned strange encounters. She recalled a late-night conversation 2 weeks before his death when Dylan said he felt like someone was following him. She had brushed it off as paranoia, thinking he was tired from work. That statement would haunt her for years. By midsummer, the case file had grown thicker, but the progress chart in the sheriff's office remained empty. Dozens of leads were crossed off one by one. The search through the Silver Creek area had turned up nothing new. Even the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, briefly consulted, found the crime too vague to profile with certainty. Public frustration reached a boiling point when the local news station aired a report criticizing the handling of the investigation. Candlelight vigils became protest rallies. Justice for Dylan signs appeared on storefronts and car windows. But hope was fading fast. Inside the Mercer home, Elaine kept Dylan's room exactly as he'd left it, the coffee apron hanging on his chair, his sketchbook open to an unfinished drawing. Each day that passed without answers made the silence heavier. By the end of the year, the investigation's funding was quietly reduced. Key detectives were reassigned. Leads went cold. The town's confidence in its own police force began to erode. As resources dried up and trust in law enforcement crumbled, what would happen to Dylan's case? By 2012, 3 years after the murder of Dylan Mercer, the investigation had slowed to a whisper. The headlines that once demanded justice were replaced by newer tragedies. Inside the Brookvale Sheriff's Department, Dylan's case file was moved from the active drawer to the cold case cabinet, a row of dust-covered boxes holding the town's unsolved pain. The once busy command center filled with maps, timelines, and photos was quietly dismantled. Detectives who had once vowed to find Dylan's killer were reassigned. The few who still remembered the case spoke about it with the weary tone of defeat. "We had nothing solid," one former investigator said years later. "No witnesses, no DNA match, no motive. It just died, but for Elaine Mercer, Dylan's mother, the case never died. It became the axis of her existence. She refused to let her son's name fade into a forgotten file. Every year on the anniversary of his disappearance, she stood by the old bridge where his car had been found and lit a single candle. Rain or snow, she stood there in silence, whispering, "I'm still here, Dylan." Elaine began to educate herself on criminal procedure. She wrote to the state's attorney general, to governors, even to the FBI, asking for case reviews. She joined online forums for families of cold case victims and attended community college classes in criminology to better understand what had gone wrong. "I didn't want to be the grieving mother on the sidelines," she told a local reporter in 2015. "I wanted to be part of the fight." But as years passed, even the town's compassion wore thin. Neighbors stopped mentioning Dylan's name. New families moved in, unaware of the story that had once shaken Brookvale. The cafe where he worked changed ownership, and the mural of his smiling face was quietly painted over. The silence became another wound. Elaine refused to stop. She organized annual memorial runs, fundraisers for victim advocacy programs, and petitioned lawmakers to expand funding for forensic testing. A small victory came when she convinced the county to recheck stored evidence for degradation. But without new technology, there was little they could do. Inside her home, Dylan's room remained untouched. His backpack still sat by the desk, his sketches carefully stacked, the scent of his old cologne faint in the air. A candle burned in the window every night for a decade, a ritual of grief and hope. People driving by at night could see that single flame, flickering against the dark Oregon forest, a symbol of a mother's refusal to forget. By 2019, Elaine was in her early 50s, her hair grayer, her hands lined from years of work and worry. She spoke at high schools about loss and resilience, warning students that violence could strike even the safest towns. Though she'd grown used to the quiet, she never accepted it. "Time doesn't heal," she said once. "It only waits in truth." But time, it seemed, was finally about to move again. Because in 2023, deep inside an Oregon State laboratory, a technician ran a new kind of DNA analysis on an old evidence swab from Dylan's case, and what emerged would reignite everything Elaine had been fighting for. Would time finally bury Dylan's case? Or was a new kind of investigation about to reopen it? By early 2023, a quiet revolution was underway in Oregon law enforcement. The state had recently launched its Cold Case Task Force, a specialized unit equipped with cutting-edge forensic tools and a mission to revisit unsolved crimes long thought impossible to crack. Among the hundreds of boxes pulled from evidence archives, one bore a familiar label, Mercer, Dylan, 2009. Inside was a bundle of sealed envelopes, fibers, photographs, and swabs that had remained untouched for over a decade. Advances in forensic genealogy had changed everything. Where the old system once required a direct match in criminal databases, this new method could trace DNA through family connections, mapping genetic lineages across states, generations, and databases used by ordinary citizens. One afternoon, a forensic analyst named Rebecca Lowe began processing the decades-old samples from Dylan's clothing. It was routine at first: extract, sequence, compare. But something unexpected happened. A faint degraded DNA strand, previously unreadable in 2009, now produced a partial genetic profile. The data was uploaded into GEDmatch, a public ancestry platform that had helped solve other cold cases across the country. Days later, a notification appeared on Rebecca's monitor. Partial familial link found. The profile didn't match any known felon in the system, but it pointed to a distant relative living in Washington state, someone who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA for genealogy research. Detectives followed the thread carefully, tracing family trees, contacting distant cousins, and building what they called a genetic map of possibility. Each branch of that map narrowed until finally, one name stood out, a man who had once lived in Brookvale during the time of Dylan's murder. His name was Thomas R. Keene. Keene had been questioned briefly in 2009, a maintenance worker who often stopped by the cafe where Dylan worked. Back then, he'd been dismissed as a harmless drifter. His alibi had seemed solid. He was supposedly out of town the night Dylan vanished. But technology in 2009 couldn't confirm or deny his involvement. Now, with new DNA linking him through a familial chain, Detectives realized his story warranted another look. When they re-examined the original case notes, small inconsistencies surfaced. Keene had been living just half a mile from Silver Creek Trail, the same area where Dylan's body was later found. He had also left his job suddenly the week after the murder, moving out of state without notice. Even more striking, his employment records at the cafe's parent company overlapped with the same shifts Dylan had worked that final month. Detectives revisited witnesses from 14 years earlier. Some remembered Keene, quiet, brooding, always watching. One former co-worker recalled him mentioning Dylan by name, saying, "He's too friendly for his own good." As the task force assembled their findings, the Mercer family received a call they had almost stopped hoping for. "We may have something," the detective said cautiously. "It's early, but this could be the lead we've been waiting on." For Elaine, it was both a blessing and a tremor of dread. After 14 years of silence, the thought of answers was almost unbearable. But in Brookvale, whispers began again, and with them, an uncomfortable question. Would this long-awaited DNA match truly reveal the real killer, or would it ignite another storm of doubt? Secrecy and controversy that could tear the town apart all over again. On a gray March morning in 2025, the quiet stillness of a Portland suburb was shattered by the low hum of unmarked police vehicles. Residents peered through their blinds as officers in plain clothes moved in formation toward a two-story home at the end of Maplewood Drive. Inside lived Thomas R. Keene, a 46-year-old maintenance supervisor with a spotless record and a seemingly ordinary life. Wife, 2 children, a Labrador that barked at strangers but never bit. At 6:42 a.m., the door opened to the sound of firm voices. "Thomas Keene, you're under arrest for the 2009 murder of Dylan Mercer." Neighbors watched in disbelief as Keene, dressed in a flannel shirt and slippers, was led away in handcuffs. Cameras weren't rolling yet. This was meant to be a quiet arrest. But by mid-morning, word had spread like wildfire. Within hours, the Brookvale community, now older, quieter, but never truly healed, found itself reliving the wound it thought had scarred over. Headlines flooded local news outlets. Cold case solved after 14 years. Cafe regular arrested in Mercer murder. The shock was palpable. Keene had been a fixture in town back then, a man known for his easy smile and small talk at Riverbend Coffee. In fact, he'd even joined the search parties during those frantic early days after Dylan went missing. Old footage surfaced showing him standing beside volunteers, holding a flashlight, shaking his head sympathetically at reporters. To many, the revelation was unthinkable, that the man who'd once helped look for Dylan could have been the one who took his life. For detectives, however, the arrest was a culmination of years of patience and new science. DNA recovered from Dylan's jacket lining had produced a familial match, which in turn led to a direct test confirming a 1 in 12 trillion probability of Keene's involvement. It was the kind of evidence that left little room for doubt. But even as officers led Keene into the booking room, questions mounted. He denied everything. "I didn't touch that boy," he said during interrogation, his voice steady. "You're making a mistake." In his suburban kitchen, police collected items for further testing: hairbrushes, clothing, even an old hiking backpack. His wife, visibly stunned, told investigators she'd never heard her husband mention Dylan's name. Their teenage daughter wept, whispering, "He's not a killer." When the news reached Elaine Mercer, Dylan's mother, she was sitting alone in her living room, the same one that still held her son's framed senior photo. The call came from the lead detective. "We have him, Elaine. We finally have him." Her response was a long pause. Then, barely audible, she said, "Why him?" She remembered Keene's face faintly. He had been there at one of the early vigils, standing behind the crowd, nodding solemnly when she spoke about her son. She never knew his name then. Now the town that once offered him trust was grappling with betrayal. Reporters camped outside his home, while social media reignited old theories and anger. As the court date loomed, one question hung in the air. Would this long-awaited trial finally deliver justice for Dylan Mercer? Or would it unravel into a public reckoning that exposed even deeper failures within the system meant to protect him? By the time Thomas Keene's trial began in the spring of 2025, the courthouse in Salem had become a magnet for attention. Every seat was filled. Journalists with cameras slung around their necks, neighbors clutching notepads, and classmates of Dylan Mercer, now adults, sitting silently behind the Mercer family. For many in Oregon, this wasn't just another cold case trial. It was a reckoning with the passage of time, with science, and with the fragile trust between justice and memory. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They began with the DNA evidence. The microscopic traces recovered from the inner seam of Dylan's jacket matched to Keene with astronomical certainty. Jurors leaned forward as the forensic expert explained how familial DNA genealogy led investigators to Keene's distant cousin in Montana, and then, through meticulous cross-checking, to Keene himself. The odds of this being anyone else, she testified, are less than 1 in 12 trillion. Then came the cell tower data, resurrected from old records that placed Keene's phone near the area of Silver Creek Trail the night Dylan vanished. Though not precise enough to show direct contact, the pattern painted a chilling outline of movement. A route from Riverbend Coffee toward the ravine, then silence. Witnesses took the stand. A former co-worker of Dylan's recalled seeing Keene frequently at the cafe, never ordering, just sitting and watching. Another remembered him showing up during the volunteer search days later, oddly curious about police progress. But the defense fought back with equal intensity. They claimed DNA contamination, arguing the sample was too small that it could have been transferred through contact at the cafe. Their expert insisted that handling evidence years later risked error. They pointed to Keene's clean record, his steady employment, and his reputation as a quiet family man. Through it all, Elaine Mercer sat in the second row, gripping a small silver pendant engraved with her son's initials. Each photo displayed, each forensic slide shown, cut open a wound she'd learned to live with but never heal. Her daughter, now in her 20s, wept quietly beside her as the prosecution replayed surveillance footage. Dylan locking up, waving goodbye, unaware of the danger waiting beyond the door. After 6 weeks of testimony, closing arguments framed the case as more than science, and it was about trust and truth. The prosecutor looked directly at the jury. 14 years ago, a young man's future was stolen. Today, the evidence, and then only the evidence, brings us here. Dylan Mercer deserves a voice. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell into breathless silence. On the charge of second-degree murder, the foreperson said, "We find the defendant guilty." Elaine gasped, her hands trembling. Some cried, others simply stared ahead, as if unsure how to feel after so many years of waiting. Outside, reporters called it justice delayed but not denied. Yet not everyone was convinced. On social media and in coffee shops, doubts lingered. Had police pursued the right man, or had the desperation for closure clouded judgment? As the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, one question still echoed through Oregon. Beyond the verdict, what legacy would Dylan Mercer's case leave? For the state, for forensic science, and for every family still waiting for justice? In the months following Thomas Keene's conviction, the small Oregon town that once mourned Dylan Mercer began to transform its grief into something lasting. What had begun as a story of heartbreak and unanswered questions slowly evolved into a symbol of persistence and progress, proof that even a cold case buried for over a decade could still find light. The Oregon Cold Case Task Force, the same unit that uncovered the DNA lead, received new funding from the state legislature. Lawmakers cited Dylan's case during their hearings, calling it a turning point in forensic justice. The initiative expanded resources for unsolved crimes, allowing smaller jurisdictions access to genetic genealogy tools once reserved for federal investigations. Within a year, 2 more cold cases in neighboring counties were reopened, both using the same techniques that brought Dylan's killer to justice. Elaine Mercer watched these developments with quiet pride. She never sought the spotlight, but reporters often requested interviews. When she did speak publicly, her words carried weight. It wasn't power that solved Dylan's case, she said at one hearing. It was persistence, a mother's voice refusing to fade. She became an informal advocate for other families of unsolved murders, writing letters, attending meetings, even speaking at a victims' rights conference in Portland. Her presence was calm but resolute, reminding lawmakers that every unsolved file represented someone's world left incomplete. Meanwhile, the Riverbend coffee shop, where Dylan had once worked late nights and sketched mountain ranges in his notebook, became a kind of memorial. The owner commissioned a mural that now covers the sidewall. Dylan smiling, a steaming coffee cup in hand, sunlight spilling over a painted Oregon landscape. Beneath it reads a simple inscription, "For Dylan, and for every voice that time tried to silence." Local schools began hosting annual essay contests in his memory, awarding the Dylan Mercer Scholarship to students pursuing forensic science or criminal justice. Dozens of young Oregonians applied each year, many citing the Mercer case as their inspiration to study DNA analysis, investigative psychology, or victim advocacy. Detectives who once worked the case still recall it as the investigation that redefined their approach to evidence. "It taught us never to close the door," one retired officer said in an interview. "Technology changes, people change, truth doesn't." For the community, Dylan's story became a quiet reminder of resilience. The same town that had once feared the woods now hosted candlelight walks every March, not just in remembrance of Dylan, but in solidarity with all families waiting for answers. And yet, as years passed and new cases filled the headlines, a lingering thought remained. For every cold case solved, hundreds still waited in silence, boxes stacked in evidence rooms, names fading from memory, families keeping candles burning in their windows just as Elaine once did. Because in the end, Dylan Mercer's legacy wasn't only about closure. It was about hope, fragile, flickering, but unstoppable. As time moves forward, one question continues to echo through Oregon's valleys and beyond. How many other families still wait for the call that changes everything? 15 years after the tragedy that silenced a quiet Oregon town, justice finally spoke. Not in triumph, but in solemn vindication. The name Dylan Mercer no longer represented loss. It came to stand for resilience, courage, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth. His story reminded the world that some lights, though dimmed by tragedy, can guide generations forward. For years, Dylan's case sat buried among thousands of unsolved files, gathering dust as hope thinned. But it was his mother's unwavering love, her refusal to let silence win, that kept his memory alive. When technology advanced, when DNA science evolved enough to find the invisible, that love met innovation. Together, they rewrote the ending. The man responsible finally faced his reckoning, but Dylan's true justice was broader than a single verdict. The investigation reshaped Oregon's cold case system, ushering in new funding, better technology, and a renewed moral compass for law enforcement. Families once told to move on began writing letters again. Detectives reopened files once thought unsolvable. Today, Dylan's name lives on through the Mercer Scholarship for Forensic Science, through a mural at Riverbend Coffee, and through every candle lit in memory of those still waiting for answers. His story endures as a testament that justice is not defined by time, but by persistence, by every parent who keeps asking, every investigator who refuses to forget, and every community that chooses compassion over closure. 15 years later, Dylan Mercer remains more than a victim of a 2009 Oregon cold case. He is a voice, and steady, enduring, and eternal, reminding us all that truth, no matter how long it takes, still has a heartbeat. Before you leave, remember this: justice isn't always swift, but it's always worth the wait.